full body people, not just screen people. So it's great to be here with you all. My name is H.G. Chazelle, and I'm the founder and CEO of Advanced Energy Group. It's an organization that I started in 2014.
So good afternoon and welcome. My name is H.G.
Yes, I could let him just do the talk. And, the same person. I thought it would be fun to start off with showing some of the videos of our work. Will Sullivan's my director of media, and for over 5 years now, we've been convening stakeholders that are committed to closing the gap on promises made and promises delivered, essentially. We're in the era of big promises, which is an encouraging sign. I think mainly because we realize that we need to change the way we're operating. And the first step in that is to make a commitment to do it, a public commitment, to take a stand for a new future. And we're seeing that now, right, with so many promises being made. The challenge is these promises don't get delivered on their own. And these are big ones. These aren't small promises, and they have extraordinary deadlines to make them happen. So who is going to be the people that deliver those promises? What's the arena that exists in order to enable this level of high performance collaboration, teamwork, accountability, urgency? I would say it really doesn't exist. And that was the real inspiration to start Advanced Energy Group, was to create an arena for the right diversity of leaders impassioned about these issues to agree on critical pain points and tackle those first. There was a large period of my life where I was on track to be an architect. I went to architecture school. It was my passion. And what I loved about architecture at the time was there was a creative aspect to architecture, and then there was the reality of architecture. Like, you had to build something that wouldn't fall down on someone. Otherwise, you as the architect was the one liable. And so that tension between reality and creativity is something that I really appreciated about architecture. And so I think it's so important when we think about this issue of how do we create the right environment for leaders to work together and really go after these issues. And I guess my greatest inspiration on this is professional sports. And full disclosure, I'm not a big sports fan, but as someone committed to stakeholder mobilization, I get jealous constantly when I turn on the television and there's the latest sports match, right? Whether it's NFL, NBA, the amount of eyes on that game. Is anybody a big sports fan? Okay. Think about the last big game you went to. The feeling in the audience, the level of stakes that people were playing for, right? The sponsorship logos all across the arena. That energy, if we could bring it into this conversation, would be transformative. Personally, I feel that's what's missing, to give us that sense of playing to win at what matters most, doing it with a sense of urgency and accountability, willing to fail and try to push yourself because you're looking towards the larger win you're committed to. And that was really a lot of the inspiration behind setting up this construct for AEG. We lead quarterly stakeholder challenges on 4 key topics. Q1 is always on critical infrastructure, equity, and resilience. Q2, we cover buildings and construction. Q3 is grid modernization. And Q4 is mobility and transportation. We run this across 4 cities on a quarterly basis, so every city runs through that topic cycle. And having done this for over 5 years across 4 cities, it's fascinating to see the emerging patterns, the common denominators, to issues showing up in Chicago, Washington, DC, and Boston. And we just don't run, as you'll see today, a gathering. You're here to compete. This is a 3-part competition. We are going to roll up our sleeves and get on the field together. And it all starts with agreeing on a problem. We walked in here from a variety of different perspectives and origins, but first we need to agree on what's the critical pain point. The patient's on the table. Are we worried about the toe, or are we worried about the aorta? Right? And unless we get aligned on knowing that critical pain point, we're not effective as a team to get anything done. Because we all have our own priorities that we see, but they're not aligned. So our speakers today are going to present what they feel is a critical obstacle to achieving Boston's carbon and energy and equity goals that must be overcome collaboratively regarding mobility and transportation. They each have 8 minutes and 5 slides to make this case to you. You are going to vote and prioritize those obstacles so that through the process we'll get to a point where we agree on a critical obstacle to focus our attention on. Once we know that obstacle, then we're going to break into teams. That's why we did assigned seating. That's why your name badge has a table number on it. And you're going to work as your table to come up with a proposed 12-month pathway that would best overcome that identified obstacle. And you're going to be judged by your peers. Your peers are going to vote, and you can't vote for your own table unless you make the down select. So you'll have to listen to the other table's opinions and approaches to this 12-month pathway. The proposed solution will have to include 3 quarterly milestones. And because we meet quarterly, the team that goes after this will have to report on their progress. So we're putting in a good dose of accountability into the mix. And you'll hear today from 3 teams that have been working all year to deliver on their 12-month solution. And they're at different stages on their quarterly milestones. And you're going to vote on whether or not they've actually been successful at doing what they said they do on their quarterly timeframes. Just this year alone, across 4 cities, we have close to 300 leaders who volunteered to be on a task force to deliver a 12-month solution to an identified obstacle. That, to me, is just a tremendous statement that this is worth people's time to focus in. These obstacles truly matter, and people want to make an impact. We are at 15 task forces that got started from these sessions just this year alone. So that gives you a framework for today of kind of the process we'll go through. It's been great to work in Boston. I've been working closely with the city of Boston with Brad Swing and others, and it's been great to work with the state. Dan, I see you here. It's great to have you as always with us, so welcome. You'll have an opportunity at your table to get to know each other, and I'll go around throughout the day and make some introductions for people. Let's see where we're going to begin for today. First, we're going to start with using Slido. So I mentioned a lot about voting. So to do the voting, you're going to use something called Slido. So to use Slido, if you take out your phone, you'll see this QR code here. Let's see if you're able to grab it. There's one in the back. And that will take you to Slido, and you'll see a prompt for what the question is, what do you feel is most important for us to discuss today? So let me know how that works for you to get on Slido. Did it work all the way from back there? Oh, great. Okay, super. It's funny, like pre-COVID, these QR codes were like, what is that? Now, oh yeah, the menu. Oh yeah. Okay, so you should have a prompt there. What do you feel is the most important thing to discuss today? Go ahead and start getting your answers onto Slido. This is where we'll use when after our speakers present, you'll see all their obstacle statements and you'll need to prioritize them. So we'll be using this throughout this morning. Good, I see the votes coming in. We've got 7 in already, 9. Great, and that'll start to populate a word cloud. And I'll be able to show that word cloud here. So for the benefit of our speakers today, you can start to see what leaders in the room consider important to our discussion today. If you haven't been able to get on Wi-Fi, the username is HKGuest and the password is orange82. All right, so equity is really coming through here as being an important aspect to this discussion. Great. And I guess it's fun that Boston is my 4th city. This is our last one of the year and last one for this quarter on mobility and transportation. Last week we were in Chicago. We had the Director of Strategic Planning for Chicago Transit Authority as one of the speakers. She ultimately won the speaker challenge. And her obstacle statement was that there's been a 3-year moratorium put in place in Chicago on transit authority having to do a 50% fare recovery. So transit gets federal funding to operate, but they have a requirement that 50% of what's collected at the fare box has to go back towards the funding, where the origin of the funding. This pretty much cripples transit to do anything innovative, because they have to provide that 50% back. And her point was, is transit a public good, or is it a public service, or is it a business? And if you see transit through those lenses, it all affects how you do operations, how you approach the business. And her point to the group was, if you look at the benefits of transit, mass transit especially, to health, to equity, and so on, it's really a public good, but they're not set up to approach it that way with a 50% requirement on fare recovery. So her obstacle statement was, we need removing this recovery so it doesn't come back is critical for really the longevity of CTA at this point. There's something now called the transit death spiral, where if you reach a tipping point of people going to cars, it's harder to get them back to transit. Transit doesn't have the money to provide the services and experience to keep them on transit. And then when transit falls, then all of a sudden a basic fabric to your city starts to come apart as well. And now there's congestion. Now there's greater pollution in areas where you don't want the pollution to be greater. So it was a very compelling discussion in Chicago, and that ultimately led to a task force focused on helping people understand why fare recovery is not the way to go for transit. So just to share what came out of Chicago. All right. So thank you for getting the votes in. We got 24 of you who responded on there, so it's good to know that you're ready to go with that. All right. I'm going to come back to that. All right, so my team has put together a couple remarks, and then we'll get started. So in this process of doing Advanced Energy Group, I was working with the Washington team, and I asked the person responsible for delivering on DC's commitment to essentially a net zero carbon city by 2040. They're one of the most progressive leading areas on achieving decarbonization goals. And one of the people key in delivering that goal for the Department of Energy and Environment, I said, well, what's the metric that keeps you up, that you're trying to deliver with all these big promises? And he says, per capita carbon emissions. We all have such agency to change our emissions, our footprint, but often we don't. And so then it has to roll up to a bigger and bigger amount of people to make the change that if we did individually changes, it would be a much less, it's like energy efficiency in a way, carbon efficiency with our footprint. So that sparked an idea to create a side company called Zero Carbon Coffee, which I did with a partner he's the coffee side, I'm more on the carbon side. But this coffee has a 100-pound carbon offset for every bag. Typically a bag of coffee, just so you know when you see it on the shelf, has about a 10-pound carbon footprint. The coffee we have in partnership with Kulp carries a 100-pound carbon offset. So essentially every cup of coffee you drink has a 3-pound carbon offset to it. And so we've gone to those who care about Scope 3 emissions, people who want to give gifts, and we have this coffee. We made Men's Journal top 5 holiday gift for last year. So I want to make sure you have an opportunity to get the coffee if you want it. It's got this code here, AEG 15, will give you a 15% discount on the coffee. And I think if you order today, you can still get it out for the holidays. So it's been a lot of fun doing the coffee side to this. For next quarter, for critical infrastructure equity and resilience, rather than do every city in the winter as we kind of go perhaps back into some challenges with COVID, we're having all 4 cities meet in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So if this is of interest to you, just want to put this on your radar. The lineup of speakers is quite extraordinary who are going to be there. I purposely looked for the leaders of critical infrastructure for each city to be represented in San Juan with the leaders of San Juan. So we're going to have the director of the Port of Chicago, while we have the director of the ports for all of Puerto Rico speaking. We're going to have the chief operating officer for DC Water speaking with the head of water for Puerto Rico. So we're bringing everyone together in an environment that has all these big windows and overlooks the ocean. So with lots of ventilation. So wanted to get that on your radar if this would be of interest to you. Okay, I've pretty much provided my welcome for you this morning. I'm really glad you could come. Thank you. I know it's not easy to go back into the real world right now, but we've done it for today. I just want to make the point for everybody at your table. We're going to go right into the holidays from this, right? So I want everyone to feel welcome to wear a mask. You know, I want to keep everybody safe, and I also want to appreciate everybody at your individual comfort levels at your table, and please encourage everybody to feel comfortable at their table if they need to wear a mask, etc. Okay? So big thanks to our sponsors. That's how we work. We're a sponsor-led organization supported by now nearly 60 organizations, both public and private, that believe that this approach to stakeholder engagement is critical to achieving these goals on energy and equity. And it's been really exciting to see the list grow. WSP has been a phenomenal sponsor of our work. They supported our dinner last night, which was excellent. But we've got utilities, as you can see. Amoresco has been key here, especially in the Boston area, for their support. City of Boston, City of Cambridge, Boston Green Ribbon Commission. These are just the ones for Boston. We have a similar set of city partners for each one of the cities as well. And the idea is to foster this sense that we're on a team together, and these are groups that are willing to be on the conversation quarter after quarter to get things done. So special thanks to those sponsors. Okay, we're going to get into opening remarks. We're going to have James Cater start us off, and then we'll go to Hayes Morrison, Chief Mobility at MassDOT. Then we'll get into that speaker challenge. Don't worry, I will make sure we have on-time arrivals and departures. So don't worry too much about the time. I'll make sure we get where we need to go. We'll hear our speakers. You'll vote. Then you're going to hear some task force updates, so you get a sense of how does this actually work, where people take this on through a year to make progress. You'll vote, and then you will go into working to craft and propose a 12-month solution. Just want you to understand, if you propose a 12-month solution as a table and the audience selects that solution, you're not obligated to be on the task force and do anything. You all are very busy, so don't feel like that accountability is kind of being foisted on you. I will say you may want to raise your hand and be on that task force. It's happened before that people, how many people are on a task force in the room right now? There you go, task force lead carries on one, great, yep. So this has happened before, which is a lot of fun. All right, so we are ready to get started with James Cater. I'm just going to bring him in, but take a moment right now if you haven't got your coffee or anything, and we'll get started. Well, here's James.
Sorry, everybody.
He's on Zoom in his pocket.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. Okay. Well, it's good to be back. There we go. It's good to be back. We have been at this for a little bit of time for the past year and a half, maybe close to 2 years now, online. And so there's nothing like being able to sort of get back in the room with a lot of stakeholders, especially around this mobility discussion. And there's, again, a culmination of another successful year, HG, in sort of guiding these stakeholder engagements. It's also the culmination of our EV stakeholder engagement series that we ran throughout 2021. And so thank you to all the stakeholders and the supporters, the partners, the friends who have been supportive of both of those things, as well as supportive of Eversource's own goals as we continue to navigate this electric vehicle world, this electric vehicle infrastructure world. We have a lot of good things that we've done over the past 4 years, but especially this year. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about those programs now that I have sort of some remarks I can make, and just to, sort of pat ourselves on the back with the success we've had. By the numbers, this program, just to back up a little bit really quickly, the state of Massachusetts allowed Eversource and National Grid, but we're going to talk about Eversource, to deploy capital. For us, it was $45 million in 2018. for the purpose of building out EV infrastructure. And what that means is paying for and building out the pipes, the wires, the transformers that allow for that advancement of EV charging stations. We pay for 90% of the cost through that construction. 10% of the cost, 15, 20% of the cost is on the customer to buy the charging station and move forward. By the end of this year, or right now, we have over 430 sites that contain approximately 4 charging ports, plus or minus, in our electric service territory in Massachusetts. That is far and away the fastest development of a EV make-ready program in the United States. And it's, you know, it's due, in fact, in part, in very large part, to all of the partners in this room, stakeholders who have had those discussions with customers, who have talked about the benefits of EV charging, who have helped move this forward. So thank you. Thank you. 2,000 charging points. That is more than doubled the existing charging points of when we started in 2018. And then 19% of the charging points are located in so-called environmental justice communities in Massachusetts. So we have been working on both infrastructure, but infrastructure crossed with equity. And there's more we can do, certainly. Some of our partners in the room are engaged with the next step of equity as it relates to transportation and electrification. And we're more than happy to be partners in that journey. But just a little bit about the background. And then what's ahead of us is the more exciting piece, right? The reason why I came rushing back in here is because we're standing up a program in Connecticut, similar program, $72 million. So I talked about Massachusetts program, that's $45 million with a $10 million extension, so $55 million. $72 million in Connecticut starting Jan 1. We also have in front of our regulators in Massachusetts a much larger program with much more benefits for customers in continuing to build out EV infrastructure that includes carve-outs for DC fast, includes carve-out for actual stations. So we'll be supporting stations as well. We'll be supporting the soft costs of the station, the networking fees for our customers. That's $192 million. Hopefully, crossing our fingers, will be approved by July of next year. And just to mention, because I know we have some folks from the state in the room, Dan Gotti, good to see you. The continuing of the support from the state for medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as the Mass EVIP program. These are just a listing of some of the things that are coming to the fore and are already currently available in addition to what we're doing. And of course, at the federal level, everybody heard about the infrastructure plan that was approved approximately a few weeks back. For Massachusetts, that looks like $63 million for electric vehicle charging stations and infrastructure. I say that to say that if you compare that to what we're going to be doing, certainly the federal funds are valuable in the state. But in terms of volume, in terms of what the scale will be, ourselves and National Grid are going to be the driving force behind putting in pipes and wires in the ground over the next few years. That's all I want to say there. And then beyond that, beyond the funding, I think some of the focus areas we're going to be focusing in on supporting a strategic DCFC deployment. We've been really successful in doing public level 2. DCFC is a bit challenging because of the first cost, because of the ongoing cost, because of demand charges. All of those things we have plans in place in our phase 2 to mitigate them. We have a demand charge rate reduction proposal. We have support for DCFC charging stations, the actual cost of them, buying that down. And we again have support for just the regular pipes and wires. We are engaged in a number of and a number of customers looking at electrification of fleets and transit. The MBTA has been having robust conversations among the community about their electrification of their buses. We have had many conversations with other large and small fleet owners, so this will be a focus area of our next round, of our next phase. I was speaking to somebody last night talking about, and I think it was Yann. I was speaking to Yann last night talking about how municipalities, our cities and towns, our communities engage in that fleet conversation. It's the public charging space first. Let's electrify some of our public lots. The next conversation is, I want to electrify my entire fleet. And so we have done the public charging. They now want to do their fleet and the support of the fleet, and we need to be ready for all of those conversations in all of our communities in Massachusetts, because it's coming, and it's coming quickly. And then continuing on this conversation about equity in transportation, Rachel Fishman is sitting right here. She is engaged in an income-tiered electric car sharing pilot. Now it's about to be a full-on business in Boston. It's really exciting. Getting customers, people who don't normally have the opportunity to drive an EV, even experience an EV, being able to rent an EV for short term with an income tiered pricing scheme where they're paying a lesser amount of dollars to get into that vehicle. We are happy partners in that regard. And then we're going to do other things with respect to equity in future, whether it is setting up EV charging station hubs, DC fast in the city, in the sort of urban center locations. But all of this is to say that there's a lot to come. I'm glad everybody's here. I'm happy to and excited to hear the conversations. But we are fit for the battle, and we're excited to be a part of it. So, thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
All right, next, I'm very excited to bring to the stage here Hayes Morrison. She's Chief of Mobility at MassDOT. It was so great to reach out to you and get your enthusiastic interest in participating. So I really am grateful that you could be here with us today. I'm going to just put this little mic on you.
Can everyone hear me? Whoa, I can hear me. Wow. So I have made, good morning to all of you. I have made a concerted decision this morning not to use a PowerPoint, and there's a reason for it. First of all, it's just great to be here in person and see all of you, and I feel like I've done nothing but PowerPoints for the past, actually, that's not true. It's not even just the past 2 years. I worked at Massport before MassDOT, and we only communicated in slide decks, so this is just, I really just wanted to take a breather and talk to y'all because this is the first time in almost 2 years that I've had the opportunity to have a technical conversation with a group of peers. So thank you for that this morning, and I hope none of you take offense to the fact that I'm just not going to do this from a PowerPoint. The second reason, though, is because I don't want to focus my remarks on what the Commonwealth has done. I want us to start thinking about what we will do. And so I don't want to run through a bunch of statistics. I want to actually kind of poise my open remarks about some questions that I have and some questions I hope that we can start to answer today. So, and I actually have already used this with my table, so sorry that you're going to hear a stale joke, but my opening remarks are from the perspective of someone who works for a statewide organization. And so when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything I am thinking about right now is about the bipartisan infrastructure law and what we think will be passed very soon, the Build Back Better program. This is by far the largest 5-year reauthorization of funds for transportation, for states, for transportation ever. Additionally, it puts $115 billion at the discretion of US DOT. That means that we have an administration that is very much leaning in not only into mobility, but if you have read the laws, into the ideas of workforce, equity, and electrification. With all of this being said, and like HD kind of prepared us for, there is your expectation as an architect and what you want to do creatively, and there's what you can do within reality, which is to say that this is federal money, and with federal money comes all of the federal expectation, at least for us at MassDOT. And with that, my question back to you is, today we're going to focus almost exclusively on what is an obstacle. I also want to think of it in a different direction. What do we do when traditional obstacles are removed? So what do we do when the yeses become yeses and not nos? We have money. We have momentum. We have an administration that is focused on these issues. What do we do when those traditional constraints are removed? I'm going to tell you what my questions or thoughts are, again, as a statewide official. The first one is speed. Again, I just told you this is federal money. It's not known for the ability to be implemented quickly. So I have questions about speed and the ability for all of us to work together to implement these funds quickly in the way that they were intended. The second one, and this one is a little depressing to me as a STEM professional, is workforce. I wish I could say I had a better outlook on that, but I don't. Unfortunately, we have not graduated enough engineers, environmental scientists, and planners in the past 5 years, and this is going to continue to be an issue. You know, if business can bring up inflation, I'm going to bring up workforce. I was lucky enough last week actually to have a conversation with the Dean of the College of Science and Math at my alma mater, Auburn University. And he also said that this is something that the College of Science and Math is starting to think about. Unfortunately, as I told him, it could be a couple years too late. You can't graduate engineers quickly, nor should you. The second one, there's momentum and there's a change in culture. How do we capitalize on that? Again, I think that exists culturally, but I do work within a bureaucracy and I don't know that it 100% exists in my building. By the way, plug your ears, I didn't say that, I'm going to completely deny it. But these things are true. So these are my questions to you that I hope that some of you are able to answer as we go through this morning. I'm really looking forward to working with all of you and hearing what you have to say on this issue. Thanks a lot, and let's just go ahead and get started. I'll err on the side of brevity.
It's so great for you to bring that into the room, this consciousness of this money being now available in here. And let me just put this on for a quick second. And it just brings to mind something from my past where I was studying design, and the design teacher said, you need to understand, and this was actually, he was getting into a little bit of a spiritual perspective, that there's gradual realization and there's sudden realization. Gradual realization happens through the ongoing commitment to something. Like you hone a craft, you get better at something, and through that process you practice an instrument, you get stronger, and then you can take on that next level. That's gradual realization. Then there's sudden realization that happens as a result of all that gradual realization coming together at an aha moment. You have a breakthrough, right, in something professionally, your work, etc. We're coming into moments of our history where we need to be doing the work to have the gradual realization so that we're best prepared for those sudden realization moments. Like when billions of dollars show up ready to go to social good, are we ready to handle it? When a tornado strikes Kentucky and it's a complete catastrophe and tragic disaster, are we ready to work together as a team at the level we should. And that moment, to arrive at that moment well, you have to be a part of something throughout the process. Imagine you're watching a major football game, and all of a sudden the players on the field say, you know, I see all these fans in the stage, and they're stakeholders too, and they've got the t-shirts on, and they're so into it. Will you run this play, and we want to let you run it? You've got the same level of passion, but you run the play, we'll watch. They would completely screw it up because they have no experience working together on the field. They're great at being kind of bleacher stakeholders, but they're not on the field, they're not making mistakes, they're not running plays, they're not getting better. And that's kind of the sense of my commitment to this approach, is to this be an arena for us to get on the field together. So when these moments of opportunity arise, we have this cross-sectional team and connection to one another, grounded in a commitment to energy and equity so that we can respond well. So thank you, Hayes, for kind of bringing that moment back for me. We're going to get started now on our speaker challenge. I want to encourage you to remember that you are listening for the obstacle to see which one you would prioritize as you hear all of them, that we need to focus in on as an intersectional team to make an impact on within 12 months. The first to come to the stage to present as a speaker challenger will be Yann Kulp. He is the co-founder and head of business development EIQ Mobility. It is a NextEra energy company. He's an entrepreneur, and I've got to know him over several years, and I'm so excited for this new phase of his business with the support of NextEra behind him to really take things forward. So Yann, welcome. Please come.
I need a badge, right? Little tag.
Yeah, I'm going to give you this, and I'll give you this. A little bit closer.
This is a close moment, right?
Yeah, I was holding my breath.
Yes, just as I try to stuff a piece of the sausage sandwich into my mouth. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I think we've known each other, I forget, it feels like a long time. The ability to have very tight communities of people who are interested in the greater good and getting shit done is really cool. So should I just click here and I keep on going? Okay. So just brief intro. EIQ, as HG mentioned, is the leading provider of fleet advisory for electrification in North America. We help fleets make decisions around their transition to EV. It's a complex decision process around vehicles, chargers, load profiles, economic modeling, sustainability outcomes, and it's a complex process. And we do a lot of data processing and data modeling and decision automation that helps them make these decisions. So we've done a lot of work with major utilities, OEMs, and fleets across the US, public and private, tons of stuff. So that's very exciting. As HG mentioned, we were acquired by NextEra Energy a year ago, and NextEra Energy is the largest developer of clean energy in the world, based out of Florida. So the root problem I get a little concerned about is the fact that a lot of the attention to transportation decarbonization is being focused on larger fleets. And that's normal, because larger fleets are the ones who are under regulatory or ESG pressure, and they have more resources, and they are just more visible. So there's a lot of reasons why these are happening. And those large fleets, we know who they are, right? The GSA, Coca-Cola, Cintas, some of yours, right? Eversource has a big fleet, or Verizon and others, right? But the reality is that if you look at the statistics of fleets in the US, 95% of fleets are medium or small fleets, right? So interestingly enough, if you look at the top 500 private fleets in the US, so that means fleets that operate vehicles for their own purposes, like PepsiCo to deliver PepsiCo stuff, or Comcast for their own purposes, right? So not delivery. The biggest fleet is maybe Pepsi, 65,000 vehicles. The 500th has 212 vehicles. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of fleets beyond those. And the same applies for logistics, so UPS, FedEx, Schneider Trucking, and others, right? And the same thing applies to public fleets. Once you go past the first few hundred, maybe a couple thousand, you're getting into the weeds. And this is really important because this is where transportation really happens, right? In terms of numbers of vehicles on the road, age of the vehicles, this is where it happens. And it's a big deal because fleets, as many of you probably know, is a massive business. In terms of number of vehicles operating in the US, it's a smaller number than total vehicles. There are about 280 million vehicles, so 40 out of that. But it's a big business, right? And they punch above their weight class in terms of emissions, right? I think the Union of Concerned Scientists estimated that roughly half of all transportation emissions come from fleets only. So, they represent, under 20% of total vehicles, but 50% of the emissions. So put yourself in the shoes of a fleet manager, right? What you're trying to deal with is a number of obstacles that are really hard to solve. Right? One of them is time. If you're a fleet manager, you are constantly putting out fires, right? The truck broke down. One of my drivers didn't show up. All the snow, etc. All these logistics means that their attention span is very limited, right? So you need to overcome that hurdle. The second is knowledge base. Right, fleet managers, fleets are extremely professional, extremely good professionals, but their whole history and experience is rooted in diesel and gasoline. And so a KWH and demand charges and rate structures is something that is completely alien to them, and so their knowledge base is not there. Third is incentives, and I don't mean utility incentives, but just sort of inherent incentives to transform. Smaller fleets are not under the gun. They fly under the radar. They're not getting a lot of attention from the mayor, right, or from Wall Street. They tend not to have that that pressure to convert. Fourth, risk. Every single fleet leader in the U.S., in the world, is fundamentally a risk-adverse animal, and they're not risk-adverse because they're evil. They're risk-adverse because their incentive and their mission in life is to deliver reliable transportation, whether it's for kids or passengers or burgers or whatever boxes, right? You have a mission to do, and you have to control your budget, right? And so fundamentally you're risk adverse because transportation electrification means that you are now messing with operational reliability and cost control. And last but not least is really capital. This is expensive. We know that the total cost of ownership over time is attractive in many cases. It will get better and better over time. But nonetheless, there's an upfront capital problem that needs to be solved. And smaller fleets don't have access to capital or the tax skills or all of the financial capabilities that are required these days to convert. So just very selfishly, what we think we can do, of course, is to fill the knowledge gap and help those fleets make decisions, right? That's what we do for a business. But this is a big, topic. And so, as I mentioned earlier, why is it so important, right? So, the top 50 private fleets in the U.S. operate, I think, 40,000 vehicles, but you can imagine that all the other millions of vehicles are not in that category. Massachusetts, as an example here, has 11,000 fleets, we believe, right? Nobody really knows. But the average fleet size is about 10 vehicles, right? This is a successful HVAC contractor, right? And all the problems I described apply to them, right? So, I think it's important from an equity perspective, right? Because these are community operators in small municipalities or small business owners who don't have the resources or skills or attention of the large organizations. It's big on impact because these vehicles represent the vast majority of vehicles on the road, right? It's not the PepsiCos, it's the hundreds of thousands of smaller fleets that operate across the US. And emissions impact is important because these are fleets that tend to have capital problems, so their vehicles are older and by definition are more emission intense, right? So the challenge I would like to submit to this group is that if we want to achieve our national and certainly Massachusetts and Boston's carbon and equity goals, critical obstacle for small and medium fleets is to overcome the access, is accessing turnkey supplies that deliver end-to-end solutions. And the reason is that simply them trying to patch together their solutions themselves is a hurdle that is so overwhelming that it may never happen, or it will take normalization of EV, which might be a decade from now, to happen before we get to that point, right? So this sort of concept of creating very turnkey solutions that grab their hand and take them on that journey from one end to other, I think is going to be extremely important to achieve. Thank you.
All right, next I'm happy to bring up Kathleen Connors. She's the founder and CEO of Voltrek. She's been a great supporter of our work in Boston and a supporter of the Mass EV Expo that we had, as you saw by the video. Kathleen, welcome. Come on up. I'm going to hold my breath while I put this on you.
Thank you. Oh, cool keyboard. He's got like all his watercolors across here. I'm just so happy to be here and actually see faces. I have known some of you just through Zoom for the last 18 months, so nice to meet some of you in person, finally. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I founded Voltrek. We are actually a turnkey supplier of EV charging infrastructure solutions. Worked with many of you in this room, including MassDOT, and I have not met Ms. Morrison, but we work with Donald Petty all the time there in your group. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the pain points we're seeing from our perspective today with EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure. Obviously, I don't need to tell everybody in this room, it needs to grow exponentially in order to support the ZEV goals that we have here, national goals. In Order 594, if you're not familiar, that's an executive order in Massachusetts that stipulates that the agencies must convert their fleets over to electric vehicles. We are so woefully behind on a national scale with charging infrastructure, especially with DC infrastructure. Somebody just asked me this morning, what's the appetite in Boston for fast charging? I said, the appetite's there, but the bowl's empty. So we need to do something to rectify that. And I've got some statistics here from the board, but we all know that increasing the public and workplace charging infrastructure directly correlates to the adoption of electric vehicles. So it has to be there. It's really no longer a chicken or an egg thing. We just have to do it. So what's been driving it from our perspective here is the boots on the ground, the EV SE rebates. That has been instrumental. And we've seen that come and go in fits and spurts over the past 11, 12 years that we've been in business. Particularly in the last 2 years, those rebates have been much better than they were in the past, with the Eversource program being very successful, as James was stating, the National Grid program, and MassDEP. If you're not familiar, they have an EVIP rebate program. So the EVIP program is pretty small, actually $4 million. Eversource, as James said, they actually had some bridge funding that was over $50 million, and National Grid. They were all very successful, but they're all closed. And so what we found is that it really drives people to complete projects that they wouldn't otherwise done, and it encourages them to scale those projects and make them larger than they would have done if they didn't have the funding. We see this especially in EJC communities. So we do a lot of work in those communities, and we have a company mission that states anything we can do to help critical infrastructure in underserviced communities or with nonprofit organizations, we do whatever we can to provide additional support in the forms of discounts and other things that we do to support them to get those projects done. But they rely heavily on having some kind of funding. And especially in those communities, you have a lot more drivers that don't have infrastructure in single-family homes. So we have a lot more what we call garage orphans, right? People in apartments that don't have access to charging. So that's more important that we have some urban charging solutions. The city of Boston is working on right now putting level 2 charging in parking lots all throughout the city. We need fast charging infrastructure so that people can use it more like a gas station model, right? Because they can't park somewhere and leave their car overnight for 8 hours. So this is all critical, and we have seen just a huge increase in the number of plugs going in the ground as a direct result of this funding being available. But what happens is it kind of comes in fits and spurts. So there ends up being gaps in the funding, and right now we're in the middle of a very big gap. So as was stated, the money is coming. We all know this big national federal infrastructure bill is going to come down to us with $63 million. But when it gets here, is the big issue. And right now, National Grid's program has ended. They're trying to do something, I believe, to get some bridge funding. Eversource is in the same boat. But as it stands, they are looking at starting the next phases of their programs in sometime at the end of Q2 or at the beginning of Q3 once that all gets approved. So in the meantime, everybody's stalled. And that's what we see happening. And with the Mass EVIT program, they sort of had some internal things going on, and it was kind of slow with the awards. It's a small amount of money anyways. So we have people waiting sometimes 6-8 months to get rebates approved. And what happens in that time is that people, they have budgeted for it. Their budget, maybe their fiscal year has gone by. They have issues, and they either move forward with a smaller project or they just get frustrated and walk away from it for a period of time. So why bridging the gap matters is just for that reason. So we just see people setting aside the projects. We lose the momentum. We're finally getting steam after 12 years and seeing the last 24 months really pick up. And then all of a sudden, probably instead of putting a piggy bank there, I should have put a big stoplight. It's just like you just hit the brakes. So it leads to all kinds of issues for our clients trying to get these projects done. It leads to budgetary issues. And from our perspective, and for people that are like us, the vendors on the ground who are designing the projects, selling the stations, contractors installing the stations, they're seeing all this pick up in work, they're hiring new staff, and then all of a sudden things stop, and now they might stop for 9 months in the state of Massachusetts. So I don't know what the solution really is here, but I thought I would put forth this for everybody to consider regarding mobility and transportation to achieve Boston's carbon, Massachusetts also carbon and equity goals. A critical obstacle is to overcome navigating the funding gaps that occur between phases of EVSE rebate and utility make-ready programs. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm walking away with your goods.
There you go. All right, next I'd like to bring up John Nolan. He's Managing Director of Transportation and the Campus Service Center at Harvard University. Welcome, John. You're welcome. It's right here.
And show me how to drive the slides here.
Your space bar or the arrow.
All right, so great. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. And interesting, HG, what you were talking about in terms of, being somebody in the stands or somebody that's actually engaged in the game. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about being engaged in the game and to talk to you about recent infrastructure and EV buses that we brought into the university. So it's great to be with everybody today. And as I said, looking at the context in which, starting with the context in which Harvard Transit sits within the university's larger sustainability program. I want to present an overview of my transit operation, the various obstacles that we overcame in getting here, discuss some of the decisions we made in implementing the reality of this project, also review essential project implementation items, and finally to present a critical obstacle to be discussed. I have to be honest, when I first reached out to AG, I said, you know, I'm happy to talk about what we've been doing at Harvard. And he said, well, we have this format that we go through in terms of this. And I can say that for me, it's really not about winning. It's really about trying to help the greater good. Our department specifically, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 220,000 pounds annually. You can see here that the university has pledged to reduce fossil fuels, be fossil fuel neutral by 2026 and fossil fuel free by 2050. Air pollutants, harmful particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides. Professor Schwartz over at the Harvard School of Public Health has done a wonderful study. Now, I've included in the slides here a link if you're interested in taking a look at that. I think it's very very informative, especially around the harmful effects of PM2 on people with medical problems, especially with lung problems. Let's see here. So the transit program, this is generally what we have. We have a fleet of about 15 buses, 6 vans, about 300 service vehicles at the university, 11 of which are hybrid, 3 electric, and 50 pieces of off-road equipment. We provide about 650,000 to 700,000 rides at the university every year. That's primarily done on the main campuses of Allston and Boston. Masco handles transportation in the Longwood campus side. All our buses are 100% ADA accessible, and the buses run on the diesel buses that we currently have, run on 20% biodiesel from a on-site 2,000-gallon biodiesel fuel tank. Vehicle replacement program, so we've constantly had basically a 10-year replacement program to try to enable up-to-date emissions and safety standards. I want to talk about project financing because that is something that's come up already in terms of the cost, and it's not an easy lift. Buses run from 800,000 to over 1 million, and infrastructure about 900,000 to 1 million plus. You know, you've heard the phrase, John F. Kennedy had said this, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think to the outside world, the feeling is that Harvard can just write a check and get this stuff done. But that doesn't work in even a large organization where service departments like myself are expected to hold to specific budget guidelines. I've been at this for a lot of years trying to bring in electrification into the university. And it's been difficult because we couldn't really fit it in. About 35 months ago, the State Department of Environmental Protection came out with grants if an entity was willing to reduce or eliminate older biodiesel buses, that they would help to fund some of that up to the tune of $500,000. And this was would be paid for through the VW mitigation funds. You know, never thinking that we would get it, but as somebody who has really been trying to get it into the university, we applied for it, and lo and behold, we got it. And so this was a real Kickstarter for Harvard. And I can't emphasize the importance that government plays in these situations. And that also triggered some other events relative to the funding. So the university has set aside $12 million for ongoing sustainability energy projects, where you would swap out, in my particular example, I oversee parking as well, and we switched out lighting, and we paid back the funds through the savings that we had. So we were able to get them to give us 0% financing for the infrastructure on this project. And for the first time, the Office of Treasury Management said that they would meet market rates of 3% in order to help fund the project. That, along with extending the amortization period from 7 to 10 years that we had on our diesel buses, and projected savings for O&M, we were able to meet net present value requirements so that we didn't have to pass on additional rate increases to the operating committee that helps pay for our buses. So that was pretty exciting to us. So we purchased 4 battery diesel buses. It represents about 30% of the fleet. Well, it's 25 now because we had to add a couple of buses that were in the plan. Again, we're going back. I'm dating us back when we started this about 3 years ago. They're 35 feet long. We didn't go with 40 because of the tight turning radiuses within the city of Cambridge. Seating is 29, but it holds 55, sometimes 60 students, depending upon what time of the day it is and how much they need to get to class because they're late. They're charged off peak. Overnight hours where demand is less and also the cost is less, and they charge in about 3 hours. Let's see here. This is an important piece relative to the infrastructure. Although the EV bus provider offered a turnkey solution, I opted for a CM at risk process due to a number of critical project management factors. First, the company had never done any work in the city of Boston, and local relationships are important in connecting and communicating with trusted entities. Knowledge of city permitting, state DEP soil regulatory permitting, state-approved remediation contractors, and required means and methods for mitigation are complicated. The lack of knowledge in these construction areas can really slow down project schedule. In addition, a lack of knowledge and coordination for community relations, external stakeholders, real estate, easements, would also have put them in a very difficult spot. Excuse me. I'm missing a slide here. So basically, the ability for this group to be able to complete it, I didn't feel was going to be successful, and I was right because we basically went with the CM piece, and that worked very successfully. There are some lessons learned though in terms of doing this. One is to expect some delays and communication coordination challenges with the power company. Demand increased warranty time for buses and infrastructure. Put a stick in the bus contract so the buses get delivered on time. Don't make any last minute changes to hard infrastructure design. Have a backup operational plan should there be project delays. And site coordination, navigation, and planning are critical to success. So the critical obstacle that I wanted to present, that Harvard hopes to be a catalyst for other universities, businesses, cities, and towns by piloting and transition to electric buses. However, it will need the support and engagement of others to move forward to 100% EV of its fleet regarding mobility and transportation to achieve Boston's carbon equity goals. A critical obstacle is the lack of mutual assistance arrangement, which enables resiliency of our fleets to run when the power grid is interrupted. So is this a policy or technical question? Does government play a role in helping to break through this obstacle, or should it be left to the market to determine, or maybe a little bit of both? With that, thank you. Thank you.
It's so interesting to see this obstacle, thinking back to New York's Stakeholder Challenge, where we had Keith Kerman. He's the chief of fleets for DCAS for the city, and he's in an interesting predicament because New York is trailblazing on electrification on transportation. The problem is when it comes to him to electrify his fleet, part of his fleet are the garbage trucks. And they're not just garbage trucks. These are also, when there's a major snowstorm, these are the plow trucks for New York. Now, how is he going to electrify the garbage truck fleet in New York City and in the middle of the winter not be concerned about a power outage that would leave trash and snow everywhere? And until there is a critical power backup plan for these critical fleets, he's in a terrible predicament of feeling the pressure to move forward, but not having the infrastructure in place to feel comfortable to make that commitment. So it ties, I feel, right in, John, to what your point is here. Is you can't go this direction if you can't have the fleets run if there's a long duration power outage. Our final speaker here is Jannet Walker-Ford. She's the Senior Vice President and Principal Director of national transit and rail. We're so grateful to have you with us. Jannet, thank you for last night. We had a great dinner last night talking about these issues. Welcome, please come on up. I'll get you mic'd up.
Anywhere you can. Thank you very much, HG, and good morning. Those were really, really intriguing obstacles that you heard so far this morning, and I look forward to presenting ours. I'm Jannet Walker-Ford, and I lead our National Transit and Rail business for WSP. And just very quickly about who we are as WSP, we're a world-leading provider of engineering and professional services, and as well as infrastructure. And we have 54,000 people approximately worldwide and 12,000 here in the United States. We're focused on solutions for communities, and those are including markets that serve water, power, environmental, and transportation. Well, I'll focus most of my discussion today. Again, we're focusing on helping communities prosper. So I want to start with what we see as the root problem. I think it's very similar to what you've already heard this morning, so eloquently discussed. As we know, this is as research shows, 60% of nitrogen oxide and PM emission in urban areas is due to medium and heavy duty vehicles. Each year, we're seeing just an enormous amount of impacts to that. Premature deaths to the tune of 4,550. Hospital visits over 4,000, and 2.7 million cases of illnesses, and unfortunate loss of work days as well. Now, the equity piece around this that is most disturbing, not that it all isn't, is that in disadvantaged communities, they are disproportionately impacted due to clearly their proximity to transportation infrastructure. Usually when we talk about being disadvantaged for transportation or transit dependent or transportation dependent, right? We're saying there's not enough, or it's not the right modes, mix of modes or frequency. So that disadvantage means that folks in communities that are disadvantaged are taking 2-3 buses to get to work, healthcare, education, and so they're disadvantaged versus those that have access that has more frequency in transportation. This takes a look at the fact that transportation infrastructure is impacting these communities because of the fact that they are there providing pollutants. And we see the examples here on the map where we're showing just that. The darker purple areas is where we're seeing a higher air pollution in these communities. And this is here right in Boston. And so we recognize that that is happening in Boston and every other city as well in the United States. And this is whether it's heavy duty vehicles that have the refrigeration and they're idling and waiting, produce factories, for example, in Chelsea, that's listed here in the map. That is very problematic, and it's something that we've got to immediately address. And thank you for my Surface trying to reboot here. So what do we see as the key obstacle with this? There are a number of priorities that we think need to happen. I think the discussion that the gentleman from Harvard just had about just capacity and prioritization, I see it as competing priorities as well. You've got so much to do, and you want to figure out what needs to go first. And so we have to have a very intentional conversation about how to prioritize what our steps are. And I think overwhelmingly, we've all said that grid infrastructure is one of the very first things that we need to take care of, because without that, we also, we will not be able to move forward and don't have the confidence from public and private sector that they should do those procurements for vehicles and fleets and that sort of thing. That is a conversation happening all over. I was just at ITS America last week in Charlotte, Intelligent Transportation Society, and we were with Duke Energy, we were with the state DOT secretary, a number of other folks, and this was the conversation. Mr. Secretary, can you tell us what the state's doing to ensure that the infrastructure grid it will be in place so that because procurement cycles are long. And there, and so that has to all be timed out and coordinated. So it's important that we prepare the utility infrastructure so that we're ready from a public and private sector side to make it happen, particularly where there's a mandate by 2030 here in Boston, correct, to get that done. So there's a lot of moving parts with that. The other thing that we don't want to do is create further inequities as we're trying to move forward. It's wonderful that we've got our bipartisan infrastructure law in place, the IIJA. We're trying to decide which thing we're going to call it. I'll call it both. It speaks right to this. It speaks right to these inequities. But we've got to think about it. And with the transit and rail hat that I wear, I'm thinking about this from every side, as we're trying to go back and grab those communities that have been left behind in the past, where they've had railroads go through the communities, where they've had bridges go through those communities. We know that crime and other issues have been created with that. But now we also know that the air pollutants that happen because of where we decide to put landfills and where we decide to put those refrigerated trucks, those are usually in low-income neighborhoods. So I know I'll be getting time in a moment, but this is really the essence, I think, of what we need to deal with. Let's address the immediate needs, but don't forget about the fact that we've got to go back and ensure no one's left behind. The corridors and logistic hubs, we've got to, number 2 in this priority, we've got to think about those as part of our planning. And then third, we've got to be thinking about the future. And as we're making these decisions, so our planning has to have the amount of flexibility that's necessary, because we know that technology moves at warp speed. What we're talking about today as a technology solution could change next week. So we have to have a plan that's future focused on that. The benefits of that are clear. Statistics have shown, as I mentioned earlier, what the health impacts are to communities. If we do nothing, if we do make a change, we're going to see differences in health outcomes. And so that's lower asthma rates, the impacts to COVID, which we're dealing with right now. Those responses and improvement will change. And something very interesting that I found in doing the research, and many of you may have known this, there's just studies that show that crime is higher in communities where the air population is higher. Now, I've read studies where I know weather has an impact. We know in Seattle, mental health is impacted because of the rain, and it's so dark at certain times in Seattle. So there's a lot of studies that show that suicide rates have gone up in cities like that where they've got weather impacts. But research is now also showing that there is impacts and increased crimes, violent crimes, where this exists. Property value, and then just a number of other disparities. So if we take no action, this will continue, and ultimately a tragedy because of the death rate that we talked about before. This example here shows San Francisco MTA. This is a transit-oriented development project that's shown here that WSP worked with San Francisco. And what they've done is they built housing on top of an electric bus depot. And this just goes to show the types of things perhaps that are already happening in Boston that can be done and this addresses some of the housing prices and some of those other issues by taking some of those challenges out. So as I wrap up, our final challenge here, comment from a WSP perspective regarding mobility and transportation to achieve Greater Boston's 2050 carbon and equity goals, a critical obstacle that we believe should be overcome is that whole prioritization discussion. Prioritize infrastructure investments to eliminate medium heavy-duty pollution emission by 2030. Thank you for your time this morning. I hope that you found my challenge interesting. Thank you, HG.
All right, this is great to have these. And by the way, one thing we do with this little microphone here that Will remind me to put back on is we've created a podcast. So you can hear, going back a couple years now, 8-minute obstacle statements across 4 cities on these issues. And it's great. If you go to SoundCloud and you look up AEG, you'll see all these obstacle statements. So if you want to just listen on mobility and transportation for the last 2 years, you can hear the perspective on critical obstacles across 4 cities, or critical infrastructure, or buildings in construction, or grid mod. They're all on the podcast. And it's been kind of nice just to have it on in the background and get a refresher. And then hear, oh, wow, that's come up again as an issue. Or now I hear Like for instance, Lenny Singh, who is Senior Vice President at Con Edison, has a major role on the infrastructure build out with Con Edison, pointed to this very issue of medium and heavy duty fleets and how it's so important to get to those fleets and help them. Like what Yann was saying, is do they have the infrastructure in place to support their electrification? So finding those common threads and denominators is very fascinating. Okay, we're going to move to the voting process. So at this point, we're going to conclude the stream. So maybe, Will, if you can help me go ahead and close out on the stream, and we'll get started with the voting. So to do the voting, you're going to go back to Slido, and I'll make sure that that is live for you to go ahead and start reading through the obstacle statements. Let me make sure I have them up and running for you. This is where you see my multitasking skill.